Welcome to Behind the Music. In our second edition, I'm going to yet again examine the background to the making of a classic album. This time it's Judas Priest's British Steel. In this video, I'm literally going to take apart what went on behind the scenes. It's going to be not so much what was on the record, but what went on off the record. In this video, you will discover how Judas Priest was suffocated by three of the greatest heavy rock bands of all time. You're going to discover how Priest's unwavering belief in themselves meant they would stop at nothing, engage in anything, to gain the success they thought they deserved, no matter what or who was thrown at them. You will discover the band that Priest admired the most. You will discover the band they could barely stand. And finally, you will discover how punk rock unbelievably schooled them for success. So here we have it. Judas Priest's sixth studio album, British Steel, released in 1980. And once again, I must state that some of the opinion on this video are mine and mine alone. By 1980, Judas Priest could have been, to my mind should have been, a resentful, frustrated, distrustful creature, forged on the anvil of ignorance, hammered and resolutely shaped by the complete indifference and antipathy of the British music media. Excluding the patchy debut offering from Rock-a-Roller, by 1980 Judas Priest had released 4 great studio albums, chock full of innovative, challenging and in some cases groundbreaking material that had either not charted at all or at best crawled into the UK top 30. And they had garnered one surprise hit single that had literally come out of nowhere. So what was the problem? What was the great British media concentrating so intently on, if not the emergence of the mighty Priest? What was keeping some glorious heavy rock music away from the public's attention, out of the limelight? Well, I'll tell you. It was the painful, lingering death throes of 3 of the greatest heavy rock bands that had ever existed. And they were all British. And in the late 70s, they were all releasing shoddy albums and they were all getting in the way. Sabbath, Zeppelin and Deep Purple. The end of the 70s saw the end of them. Sabbath's 76th release, Technical Ecstasy, 78's Never Say Die, saw the band nosedive in creativity, and Ozzy jumped ship to form a better band with better material. Purple's 74 offering of Stormbringer and 1975's insanely misguided Come Taste the Funk, band, were so bad that I actually believe the rumours that John Lord & Co. simply imploded in shame on a day trip to Dresden. And it took 10 years to put all the bits back together. And then there was Zeppelin, who admittedly divided opinion with 76's unbalanced presence, but lost it spectacularly with the god-awful In Through the Outdoor, released in 1979. Throughout all these years, Priest were releasing great albums, touring their collective arses off, supporting anyone and everyone, but simply couldn't get a look in, as the UK music media spewed forth lengthy heavy rock obituaries. Let's just think about that for a moment, acknowledging the enormous egos that are contained within Judas Priest. How do you think that made them feel? Especially when Priest undoubtedly believed that they were the band the media should have chosen to pick up the heavy rock mantle from the bloated corpses of Zeppelin and co. To fill this vacuum that the great British music media was bemoaning. But they didn't. And to make matters worse, Priest could see a band that they admired and held in high esteem, who I believe they saw many similarities with, buck this trend, become media darlings and a firmly established worldwide success. The band Halford told Rolling Stone magazine that he had always been a massive fan of. The band he said Judas Priest were a heavy metal version of. The band Priest admitted they were sometimes walking a tightrope with, between being influenced by and being inspired. The band who had given Judas Priest the template for their only hit single to date. Queen. Take on the World was that lone hit single lifted from fifth album Killing Machine, and it was Priest's answer to Queen's We Are the Champions, which had been released the previous year. Tipton claimed sometime later that it was the answer to Queen's We Will Rock You, but this is doubtful. A live version of We Will Rock You was released as a single, but later in 1979, taken from the Queen album Live Killers. I suppose Tipton thought We Will Rock You sounded a bit more heavy metal than We Are the Champions. I have to note that KK Downing wasn't as keen on Queen as Tipton and Halford. He stated that the track Last Rose of Summer off Sin After Sin sucked because it actually sounded too much like Queen. I guess it brought back bad memories of the Tipton-penned epitaph from Sad Wings of Destiny. I think we all had our problems with that one. Downing thought that Tipton and Halford would often go onto what he called their Queen bandwagon. When asked, Tipton sidestepped the issue, stating carefully, one feels, throughout our career we've observed successful professional bands and we have gained inspiration but recreated it in our own unique way. And as we shall discover later, you can add Kiss and AC/DC to that unique recreation even. But back to the late 70s. So how did the great British music media fill the musical vacuum left by Purple, Zeppelin and Sabbath? That in many ways, let's face it, they had manufactured. Because they didn't look to Judas Priest or to UFO or Thin Lizzy for that matter. Oh no, they ran arms wide open to embrace three chords delivered at breakneck speed in a welter of phlegm. Punk. If the great British rock bands were finished, and they undoubtedly were at this point, then punk was the new scowling kid in town. Punk hit hard in 77 and 78 when Priest released not one, not two, but three classic albums, and they never got a fucking sniff. And when punk imploded, as it was always going to do, what did the British music press do then? I mean, what could they possibly do to undermine Judas Priest even more? To rub salt into their wounds, to grind their faces into the dust, hammering a nose that was already severely put out of joint. They embraced, with manic enthusiasm, a series of brand new heavy rock acts, lauding them with plaudits for a single debut album, when Priest should have been getting these same accolades for a fantastic back catalogue that most of these new acts could never hope to emulate. And they called it the new wave of British heavy metal, just to make it worse, just to spell it out. And yet, having said all that, how was it that in 1980, with the new wave of British heavy metal dominating the media, how was it that Judas Priest were about to record the album that would define heavy metal, break them from relative obscurity into an arena headlining act? What happened? How did it happen? Because it bloody well did, and not a second too soon. Well, it happened because Judas Priest had the skill set to make it happen. They were ruthless. They were intelligent. They were stubborn. Some of them egocentric to the point of narcissism. And that's not a criticism. But above all, this band were past masters at turning a negative into a positive. This ruthlessness, or perhaps single-mindedness, in their hunt for success was apparent from very early on, in the manner they broke their first recording contract. Priest had released their first 2 albums through Gull Records, but when it came to recording third album, Sin After Sin, CBS contacted them, offering a far better deal than they were getting with Gull. So they quite literally walked away from Gull, broke their contract, thereby relinquishing all rights to their first 2 albums, and all and any demo and live recordings therein. Rock-a-Roller was no great loss, but nowadays Sad Wings of Destiny is looked upon as a pivotal moment in the history of heavy metal, and I believe it to be one of Priest's most important albums. But they simply kicked it into touch. And when Priest broke big, and much to their subsequent displeasure, Gull Records really milked what they had thrown away. Priest also had no problems covering material already written by other bands to release as singles in the hope of a hit. Contrast this to the previous video I did about AC/DC, who while recording Highway to Hell flatly refused to even entertain the idea, despite tremendous pressure from their record company and producer. Not Priest. They wanted a hit single and they didn't care if they wrote it or not. When CBS suggested a track, they did it no matter how uneasily it might have sat with their own material. In fact, every album they did for CBS included a cover. On Sin After Sin, it was the held over Diamonds and Rust by Joan Baez. On Stained Glass, it was Spooky Tooth's Better By You, Better Than Me. And the US version of Killing Machine had Green Manalishi by Fleetwood Mac. None of these panned out as hits, but the fact that they didn't stop Priest trying again and again and again. But this ruthlessness, or single-mindedness, to make it at all and any cost, really came to a head with 1979's live offering, Unleashed in the East, released the year before British Steel. When a band doesn't cut it through record sales, a record company will always attempt to recoup some of their outlay with ticket sales. In 1979, Priest was so very far from cutting it that CBS had them booked out for the entire year. Their explanation to the band for this was slightly more diplomatic. Halford recalls, and I quote, "CBS would tell us you're up against some big bands, so you can't afford to stop or let this fizzle out. There's no time to slow down." Right. The result of such intense touring was that Priest simply didn't have the space to record an album in 1979. So CBS suggested recording a couple of the forthcoming Japanese shows to be released as a live album. And so they did. Unleashed in the East was recorded over 2 dates, and forgive the mispronunciation, I will say this wrong, Kazai Hall and Nakano Sun Plaza Hall. Okay, first things first, elephant in the room. Unleashed in the East is touted by some as being one of the greatest live albums ever recorded. And I agree, it's certainly up there with the very best. Solid top 3 contender. But it's not a live album. I mean, some of it is, but some of it isn't. It wasn't nicknamed Unleashed in the studio for nothing. Halford himself admits that his vocals were all over the shop when he listened back to the initial mixes, and put his inability to hit the high notes down to a combination of jet lag and fatigue. An excuse Halford doesn't use, but could well apply, considering CBS's desire to make sure that Priest's feet never actually touched the ground between albums, is that back in the 70s, it was commonplace for bands to do 2 shows in one day to maximise ticket sales. It wouldn't have surprised me to find that's exactly what Priest were doing, and if that's the case, that certainly wouldn't have helped Halford's voice. As for any tampering with the guitars, KK Downing emphatically stated that he didn't need to re-record anything, whereas Tipton admitted that there was some patching up. Tom Allen, who remixed and produced the album and was even more diplomatic / vague, claiming that he couldn't really remember what went on, but he didn't think that there were any guitar overdubs, and I quote, only some vocals, but nothing major. Well, if Allen thinks re-recording the entire vocal from every song was nothing major, who knows what he might have missed? Sorry, forgotten. And so is that it? Have we got all the skullduggery, single-mindedness out of the way? If only it were. But it's not. It gets worse. More single-minded. The cover of Unleashed in the East, out of all Priest covers, is regarded as iconic because it's a live picture of the band dressed for the first time in full regalia. It's all leather, studs, chains, and with Halford not so much cap in hand as cap in handcuffs. I say all the band, but if you look closely, there is in fact one band member that you can't see. Drummer Les Binks. And the reason that you can't see Les is because Les isn't there. And he isn't there because the shot wasn't taken at a live show in Japan, as the record would have you believe. No, the cover is a fake mock-up taken after the tour had finished, rumoured to have been done at Dunstable Civic Hall, when Mr. Binks had already departed the band to pastures new. Oh dear. Okay, so although it's not actually completely live, and the cover is a misrepresentation of where it was actually shot, Unleashed in the East is still a great record, possibly my favourite live album ever, and definitely my favourite semi-live album ever. And a lot of that was down to one man, producer Tom Allen. I'm not sure why Tom Allen was chosen to mix and produce Unleashed in the East, or why they did it at Tittenhurst Park in Startling Studios. Once owned by John Lennon and now rented out by Ringo Starr, that's Startling Studios of course, not Tom Allen, that would be crazy. The impression you always got with Priest is that the record company pretty much told them where they were going to record and who was going to produce. Priest just went there, got on with it. So maybe Allen and the band having the same management was the only reason he was chosen. But I have a sneaking suspicion that Allen pushed hard himself to get this gig. Why? Because he was a huge fan and had been for some time. What is not talked about enough is that Allen had tried to hook up with Priest years before. He had seen them rehearsing material for Sin After Sin, and impressed, he had asked if he could produce the album. Not feeling comfortable with him, seemed too posh, KK Downing, the band had refused. On an aside, let's just take a minute to think through the ramifications of that, because I believe that refusal was the worst mistake Judas Priest ever made. Just think how different their career might have been if a classic album like Sin After Sin had been properly produced by someone who got the band and was a true fan. It's a huge moment and a huge mistake. And to make matters worse, Priest got their fingers burned very badly on that record because the production for Sin After Sin was pretty much of a circus. CBS wanted the experienced Roger Glover of Purple fame to produce, but Priest sacked him after just one session, deciding to go it alone. They then got into a hopeless mess and Glover was reinstated with only 6 days left to sort the entire album. And it showed. But back to Unleashed in the East. Alan's obvious natural sympathies with the band's music, his sterling efforts to salvage something from the awful mixes he received, Halford's admirably forthright quote on his original vocals, Tom was doing his best, but even he couldn't polish a turd, led to Alan being an obvious choice to use again for British Steel. If you're going to make a classic album, as Priest were about to do, you have to remember that every single thing has to be right. Having the songs is only half of it. You have to have the right studios, and sitting in those studios, you have to have the man who will make your songs come to life. A bad production can kill even the greatest material. And Priest have been prime examples of this. Christ, if you go by the production standard of their first few albums, Judas Priest wouldn't have known a good mix if it had been presented to them in a gift-wrapped bag of pick and mix saying decent production inside. CBS have to take some of the blame as well. Sad Wings of Destiny was produced by a couple of guys whose claim to fame was playing in a semi-successful reggae band. We all know the shit show that was Sin After Sin, and for Stained Glass, CBS threw them a delightful curveball with one Dennis McKay, whose entire resume up until that point consisted of jazz fusion artists, plus Supertramp. But McKay thankfully turned out to be a fortuitous fluke, because fourth album in, I believe Priest finally found a producer who got the band, who realised their strengths even if at that time they didn't. Halford said McKay was always on at them to stop their, quote, prog rock noodling, and whose mantra for Stained Glass was, quote, shear off the waist, hit people with the sharp end. For Killing Machine it got even better, with James Guthrie, who gave the band their best production to date. That's because Guthrie was an engineer first and foremost, and he concentrated on the technical aspects of production. He was far more involved in the nuts and bolts of the mix, which was exactly what Priest needed. Anyways, commercially, Unleashed in the East was a timely breakthrough for the band. In the UK it hit number 10, but far more importantly, in the States it hit 70. This was the first time Priest had been in the Billboard Top 100. It was so successful simply because in a live environment the songs really came into their own. They had the power and guts that the deadpan studio versions lacked. In many ways I've always seen Unleashed as a clearing of the decks. One last hurrah for the old style Judas Priest before the new, how shall we say, entitled Judas Priest. But this revamp didn't come from nowhere, it didn't just happen. The seeds of British Steel were definitely sown on previous album Killing Machine. Killing Machine is the sound of Priest starting to simplify. Hellbent for Leather, the track, is Breaking the Law, Mark 1. The prototype of Metal Gods is Delivering the Goods. Rock Forever and Running Wild are both harbingers of Priest's new philosophy, even though they still had stuff like Evening Star and Before the Dawn. And of course Killing Machine contained the track that changed everything, Take on the World. It was a shock hit, selling 400,000 copies, hitting number 14 in the UK and getting them on top of the Pops, which according to KK Downing, quote, sure as fuck surprised them. Well, it certainly opened their eyes to what could be. The success of that record gave Priest a taste of what they wanted, and it gave them a style of writing which ensured that could happen. Killing Machine set down the basics and gave Priest essential proof that how they were evolving their sound could get them the success and the respect they felt they so richly deserved. And again, credit has to be given to producer James Guthrie. His hands-on approach to producing, I believe, allowed the band the freedom to relax. And I believe this lack of musical tension, apart from who did what solo, endowed the material on Killing Machine with a fluidity that hadn't been seen before on a Judas Priest record. But there was still a lot of work to be done, because Killing Machine needed binoculars to see the Billboard Top 100. After Killing Machine, I believe Priest were inexorably working toward a metamorphosis of their sound and their look. The fact that image and music were going to be inextricably linked was a long decided rule. This strong sense of perception of creating a uniform to unite a movement had first occurred to the band way back with the advent of punk. Though the movement was a major problem for Priest in terms of viability, they were intelligent enough to see certain similarities with heavy rock. Both styles were regarded as the underdog, loud, dirty, frowned upon, unsocial, etc., etc. But Priest saw how, as opposed to heavy rock, punk utilised a strong image which drew the kids and the media right into it. Punk had a uniform. This really appealed to KK Downing especially, who out of all the band members was investing a lot of thought into how Priest should be perceived by the media and through them, their fans. Downing stated that the imagery and feel of what Judas Priest was all about was always much more at the forefront of my mind than anyone else's. And giving credence to this was footage from a tour of Japan in 1978, where Downing was the only member dressed in black leather with the obligatory studs. The others were totally nondescript, though as I do remember, Halford was wearing a rather fetching tangerine sash. But give Halford his due. Out of all the band, KK Downing knew that Halford would be the most open to adopting the new look he was devising. Downing states, somewhat diplomatically one feels, that, quote, Rob was particularly legitimised by leather and studs from the outset. All he needed was the green light. Well, he certainly went for it, embracing the whole concept rather avidly, adding cap and bullwhip, handcuffs, motorbike. You get the picture. It all became very personal. In fact, there is the famous story that when Priest first played Top of the Pops for Take on the World, the Osmonds were on the same show, and Marie Osmond told the producers that she was unhappy that Halford would be brandishing a whip on stage. According to Halford, he confronted her in her dressing room, stating that he was using the whip because, quote, it's what we do. Now, I'm not sure if Halford was utilising the royal we here or not, but the boy was definitely in all the way. And then, as fate would have it, while Judas Priest were in the process of evolving this perfect circle of sound and vision, they got a bird's eye view of two bands showing how it could be done. The incessant touring finally paid off. Priest did two massively important support tours just before they recorded British Steel. The first was in America, where they supported Kiss on their Dynasty tour. The band's flamboyant makeup and costumes, mirrored almost religiously by their fans, the Kiss Army, gave Priest a glimpse of the perfect symbiosis of music and image. They followed that by supporting AC/DC on the European leg of their Highway to Hell tour. KK Downing stated that he remembers touring with AC/DC more fondly than almost any tour he ever went on with Priest. And only part of that was because both bands hit it off. Watching from the sidelines, Priest, as they had with Kiss, got an education. It reminded KK Downing of the first time Priest supported Status Quo. Both bands gave him the same feeling that they were untouchable in a live environment. Quote, the fans knew every word of their songs. There was absolutely nothing we could do about it. You could play intricate solos, do whatever you wanted. I presume he means musically. It made no difference. Comparing both bands directly to Judas Priest, Downing states that as much as Priest might have eclipsed both of them in a number of areas, I think he might mean as technicians, I quote, "They were better than us in a couple of really key ones. They had intangible ingredients that we simply did not have." Downing was really examining two things. The nature of AC/DC's material, which was like Kiss, was simple, it was short, it was anthemic, and the way the nature of the simpler material allowed the fans to garner a much fuller and more complete relationship with the band. A rapport that Priest, with their past metal noodlings, had found it impossible to achieve. In fact, this had been remarked upon and stored in the Priest memory banks as far back as Punk. Yes, Punk again. Halford states that the band noticed how successful the short, sharp Punk songs were, nothing longer than 3 minutes, often a lot less, and he states that it actually planted a seed that finally came to fruition when they were writing British Steel. And of course, Priest cleverly subjugated the ultimate symbol of punk and used it as their own for the British Steel cover. They knew what they were doing. That wasn't a coincidence. Irony was always a strong point with Judas Priest, and it was often overlooked. And so, armed with the look they wanted and a strong philosophy of where they were going with their sound, Priest were undoubtedly a band on a mission when they returned to Tittenhouse and Startling Studios with Tom Allen. Before we examine the album British Steel in depth, I want to explore Priest's, I believe, complicated relationship to the new wave of British heavy metal, which was dominating the UK when they recorded British Steel. Priest had already had their fingers burned by one movement. The new wave of British heavy metal was not going to be punk Mark II for them. They were not going to be steamrollered by. But the new wave of British heavy metal struck far closer to home than punk, and therefore generated far more pressure. CBS, who up until now had never burdened the band too much, were starting to climb on their backs. CBS had had their appetites whetted by the hit single from Killing Machine, even more impactful by being unlooked for. And the fact that the new wave of British heavy metal acts were getting hit singles straight off the bat led to CBS demanding more of the same from Priest with the British Steel album. And the band that CBS were throwing in their faces wasn't Def Leppard or Iron Maiden, but Saxon. Saxon preempted everyone in the singles stakes by having two big hits in 1979 off their second album, Wheels of Steel, the title track and Strangers in the Night. The pressure from CBS to commercialise and Judas Priest's efforts to appease them would eventually spiral out of control and culminate in the calamitous Point of Entry album, my opinion. Now, Priest claim that they knew very little about the new wave of British heavy metal. We have Downing's comment that the bands confused him because they all look so different, and that when they took Iron Maiden out as support for the British Steel tour in the UK, they knew absolutely nothing about the band. Don't believe them. Everything that I know about Priest up until that point leads me to think that simply could not have been the case. From a band as intelligent and focused as Judas Priest, who utilised anything and everything in the pursuit of success, who left nothing to chance, they would have to be deaf, dumb and blind not to have known about the new wave of British heavy metal's leading light, Iron Maiden. Priest were past masters in understanding the advantages of having a great support act. Christ, hadn't they been that very band for years? Do you think they would have left the support to their biggest headlining tour to chance? No. They had Iron Maiden pegged as support for solid reasons. The more mundane was that Priest knew that Maiden in the UK were the most popular of all the new wave of British heavy metal acts, and they knew their fans would bolster ticket sales, which they did. They wanted sold out shows, which they got. But I believe there was another reason they wanted Maiden that was rather more complicated. I believe it was all tied up in the need for respect. Of all the new wave of British heavy metal bands, it was Maiden who flew their Priest influences at full mast. It was there in their use of the twin guitars and their stop-start progressive material. And Priest must surely have realised this. Now they say that familiarity is the sincerest form of flattery. But with Judas Priest, this familiarity, though it did not breed contempt, I feel bred resentment. In fact, when asked about the new wave of British heavy metal, KK Downing rather passive-aggressively stated that the bands of his generation made sure that they didn't rip each other off, his words, having their own shows and their own image. Now, Maiden's music sported a confidence that was the ultimate in self-reliance. Remain true to yourself and your music and you will find an audience. And Maiden had cracked it from the word go. I believe that Priest had that exact same belief, but had failed to find an audience over 5 albums. I think it galled Priest to see that Maiden was simply in the right place at the right time, riding high on the new wave of British heavy metal. Priest had had no such luxury. Throughout their career, their specialised subject was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, through no fault of their own. Maiden had chart success with material that was complex and challenging. Priest had not. Someone from Saxon, who shall be nameless, was quoted as saying, "Listening to Iron Maiden, you keep waiting for them to hit the chorus, and they never do." Priest had been forced to evolve an album that, as we shall see, was going to be full of songs that lived and died by the chorus. This was not lost on the band. Note that Ian Hill, when asked about the troubles they had on the first tour with Maiden, glossed over them and said that musically he gave Maiden credit for having the balls to know what they wanted to do. Tipton said, "Yes, Iron Maiden are very influenced by Priest, but they did it their way, and all credit to them for that." These quotes were said years later when the dust had long settled. Judas Priest's mindset at one level in taking Maiden out undoubtedly was to destroy them in front of both sets of fans, show them who the true gods of heavy metal were, sort these upstarts out. And that was before things got nasty. KK Downing went absolutely ballistic when Paul Di'Anno said before the tour had even started that Maiden would blow Priest off stage every night. Downing reputedly wanted them thrown off the tour, but was outvoted by the rest of the band. Again, if they knew nothing about Iron Maiden, why would they do this? Why would they even care? And of course everything was compounded when Maiden came, supposedly uninvited, to watch Priest rehearsing, seeing their stage show, outfits, and hearing the new material from British Steel. Downing believed that Maiden came to Priest rehearsals just to spy on them. Halford states that Downing could hold a grudge, but I think his reaction went way beyond that. Examine this quote from KK Downing on the incident. "I think they had a quest to unsettle us and overthrow us." Quest? Overthrow? Was he dressed in a suit of armour when he said that? Was that vengeful spittle sliding down his open visor? I mean, I jest, but KK Downing was deadly serious. That is how passionate he was over what Priest were about to achieve. I think Priest thought that with the new look and evolved sound with British Steel, they had finally found the holy grail of heavy metal. And they didn't want the band that KK Downing said were petty and unpleasant and thought the world owed them a living, sitting there taking notes. What I feel might especially have angered Mr. Downing is that Iron Maiden heard some of the new material. that Downing was quite rightly so protective about. You see, somewhat unusually, Priest weren't actually going to promote any material from British Steel on that tour. This was, though, very much a last-minute decision. Grinder and Stealer were the two songs they thought they might showcase, and therefore were probably the two tracks that Maiden heard being rehearsed. Priest decided instead, at the very last minute, to ring the last promotional drops out of Unleashed in the East. On an aside, an interesting point is that both the British Steel and Iron Maiden albums were released almost simultaneously in March of 1980, and both achieved the exact same position in the UK charts, number 4. And so to British Steel. By the time they returned to Tittenhurst to record, drummer Les Binks had left the band. There are various reasons cited for this, but the one that Binks himself claims is that he left following a row about his fee for the live album, Unleashed in the East, i.e. he didn't get one. But drummers change the feel of records, and there's no doubt in my mind that Binks wouldn't have been the right fit for the new, simpler material Priest were writing. Even though I consider Binks to be not just a great drummer, but an actual innovator in terms of technique. His replacement, Dave Holland, Extra P's, was a better fit. He had a far simpler, almost tribal sound that Alan cleverly highlighted by reducing Ian Hill's bass drastically in the final mix. An important development in the songwriting department had also been sorted for British Steel. So everyone was singing off and, more importantly, getting credit for the same heavy metal hymn sheet. Tipton, Halford and KK Downing would all, for the first time, share songwriting credits. I think the role of who did what and where had started to become a bone of contention within the band on Killing Machine. This newfound transparency solidified things and made Priest more of a cohesive songwriting unit. As ever, Priest were under a tight schedule and budget from CBS. I mean, the band were broke at the time of recording British Steel, and they had literally a month to do it. Now, one band member claims that they entered Startling Studios with absolutely nothing written, whereas another band member says they had 5, maybe 6 songs down and the rest to go. I tend to believe the latter, because even though Priest were never a band to write on the road, it is hard to believe they entered Startling with absolutely nothing, and left it almost immediately as Priest and Alan found Startling too small and claustrophobic for the new expansive sound they were going for. They decided to record in the house itself. The drums were done in the hall, the guitars were picked up in various rooms. Alan has always downplayed his role in the recording of British Steel, and I think he is just a self-effacing kind of guy, because his input and his ideas were essential. In the past, Priest had always, as tradition dictated, put the drum tracks down first, but he had them play everything live. I think he knew what they could do in a live setting from mixing Unleashed in the East, and he wanted that same power and fluidity to fuel the more direct material they were recording. In 1980, sampling was not an option, and it was Alan who suggested and actively encouraged the band to experiment. To that effect, Priest slammed doors, swung billiard cues, bounced trays of cutlery, smashed bottles and dropped gongs, all for the sake of heavy metal. And it worked. As for the lyrics, Halford for British Steel wrote far more positively than in the past. Christ, he was almost boisterous, from the fun-loving criminal of breaking the law to the bonkers conflagration of rapid fire to the boastful trumpetings, yes, I did say trumpetings, of metal gods. This cocksure attitude was due to a combination of dumbing down for a simpler style of music and also feeling far more comfortable, armed with the new look, with his role within the band. It's also noticeable that Halford mostly condensed his range for the new material, while Tipton and KK Downing drastically shortened and simplified their solos, because British Steel at its very essence was all about stripping things down. Tipton stated that, quote, "We realised that it was all about getting the most out of our riffs." Halford states that all the songs were direct, sharp, to the point. The band's motto for British Steel was "Minimal is maximal." Yes, maximal is a word, and I think we get the picture. Less is more. Every track was there to unite old fans and entice new, because with British Steel, Judas Priest were playing both ends against each other. In the short term, they wanted to consolidate their fan base. You had Halford stating that British Steel was a message going out to the youth of Britain. Downing saying that the cover was every bit as important as the songs, with the Wilkinson sword razor blade being uniquely British, blah, 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 blah. But, and though the band might have been desperate to finally get the UK behind them, it palled before their real task, the conquest of America. That's another reason Tom Allen was such a crucial find. He had a reputation for producing polished, radio-friendly material. He knew instinctively what sound the American market responded to. In fact, the last album he produced, before British Steel, was Def Leppard's On Through the Night, another band unashamedly aiming their material at the US market, and a band Priest got on very well with. In fact, Leppard were quite blatant about it. They even had a track saying "Hello America." Priest didn't quite go that far, but believe me, it rankled with the band that they hadn't got the success and respect they thought they deserved in the UK, from either the media or the public. I believe in 1980 they simply felt shortchanged. British Steel was a success. It got their foot in the door regarding America, but as we all know, it was screaming for vengeance. Released 2 years later when Priest finally broke big in the States. I find the following quote from KK Downing very interesting. When asked why Priest ignored Europe and the UK when they toured the US exclusively in 82 and 83 in support of that album, Downing stated, "US audiences have been much kinder to us than the British ever have been. We're concentrating on delivering the goods there." No pun intended. But message received. And so on to the album itself and a breakdown of the tracks. I'm doing the European version of British Steel. With the American version, the track listing is different. Rapid Fire starts us off, and this slams out of the speakers, grabs the listener in a chokehold and screams straight into his face. Rapid Fire exhibits more muscle and sinew than any track Priest had ever done before. It's brutal, majestic, regal, even if the middle riff owes a lot to Budgie's Bread Fan. The solos are immense, needle-like stabbing shots of vitriol. They literally drill through the riffs, while Halford's vocals are a guttural diatribe celebrating the almighty omnipotence even, of the mighty Priest. Metal Gods is next, and on an aside, this is definitely autobiographical. How could anyone think that they weren't writing about themselves? Narcissism was always an underlying factor with Priest, and why not? They had a lot to be narcissistic about. Metal Gods slows it all down, mid-paced, and is even heavier for it. A chomping, marching, inexorable force with a great, great atmospheric chorus. It stands tall amongst the welter of clashing cutlery and whizzing sticks of maple. An absolute pole driver of a song. Breaking the Law is up next, and the best thing I can say about Breaking the Law is it does its job, which has, it was a hit single. It's just a little too simple, too lightweight for me. I mean, there isn't even a guitar solo. But as I say, it does the job. Next up, Grinder, and it just got heavier. Black hole heavier. The listener is being swallowed into submission. This is serious, regimented mayhem. So impressive, so imposing. Halford's vocals, spot on again. Next up is United. And have to say, United starts off okay until you hit the chorus. If every song in British Steel was designed to live and die by the chorus, then United should have been smuggled out of the studio in a body bag. I kid you not. Not their finest moment. You don't have to be old to be wise, and they are back on their high horse. For me, one of the best tracks on the album. Surely only its length stopped it being a single. Halford rarely opens up on British Steel, but he does here. And the killer riff they hold out to be admired is so bright and shiny, they were probably combing their hair in it. Living After Midnight boasts the catchiest chorus Judas Priest had ever come up with. It's so good that they didn't play it twice. It's so good that they played it first. I mean, it's very unusual to start a song with the chorus, but they knew what they had. And Living After Midnight was the track that got them the radio play they were so desperate for in the States. Next up, The Rage. I feel its quirky intro ruins the flow of the record. It's a case, I believe, of Priest being different for different sake. I could have done without it. Would have preferred them to have gone straight into the main body of the song, which is colossally heavy and has the feel of older Priest about it, and is none the worse for that. The Rage, I believe, was one of the last songs written for this album. Priest end British Steel with a fast-paced bookend, Stealer. This is an exquisitely worked song that is all about mood and momentum. The ending is unsurpassed. The last quarter of the track has no vocals and just revolves around a wonderful hammered riff through which the guitar solos blow in and out. Enthralling, atmospheric, a truly sinister metal coda. When it finally ends, the silence is deafening. British Steel as an album absolutely flies by, giving you the false impression that it's a short record, but it's actually slightly longer than preceding album Killing Machine. When released, British Steel hit 4 in the UK charts and 34 in the States. Killing Machine's highest position in America was 128. With the release of British Steel, Judas Priest enjoyed 3 hit singles in the UK. It seems that 6 years and 6 albums in, Judas Priest were finally in the right place at the right time. So, is British Steel Priest's best album? Maybe not, but it's certainly up there. Is it their most important album? Well, British Steel is not just Judas Priest's most important album, it is one of heavy metal's most important albums. The Guardian referred to British Steel as the record that defines heavy metal. Perhaps even more telling, Rolling Stone placed it 3rd in the 100 greatest metal albums of all time. KK Downing stated that heavy metal needed to be more than just a name. It needed to be a thing. It needed to be identified, and with British Steel, Priest achieved that. With British Steel, Judas Priest made heavy metal 3-dimensional, gave it shape and colour, gave it a body and a face. It was also their heaviest album to date, and it's surely ironic that it's with this record that Judas Priest linked most strongly with their beginnings. British Steel articulates, both in weight and character, the industrial background in which the band grew up, and which influenced them so greatly. And I don't think the irony of that would be lost on them. Well, I hope you've been informed and I hope you've been entertained. If you enjoyed this video and haven't already, please check out my other video, Behind the Music of AC/DC's Highway to Hell. I'd love to hear your comments, and if you feel so inclined, ascribing a like to this video would be great. Oh, and perhaps you could use just the right amount of force to push the subscribe button. Till the next time.